the Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast. Audio drama, poetry, fiction.
You're listening to the Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast. In this edition, we talk to novelist Fiona Mountain. We look back at her career and bring you extracts from some of her books with reader Sally Walker-Taylor. We also look forward to Fiona's upcoming novel The Keeper of Songs and the audio drama version of it, which we're making here at Alternative Stories. As always with conversations conducted via Zoom, there might be one or two sound issues, but we hope this won't spoil your enjoyment of the podcast. The interviewer is me, Chris Gregory. Fiona Mountain, welcome to Alternative Stories. We've been working together for a while now, along with Nicholas John, on an audio drama version of your forthcoming novel, The Keeper of Songs. So without too much plot spoiling, can you give us an idea of what your readers and our listeners can expect from the book and the audio drama?
Hi there. So The Keeper of Songs is essentially about what we hand on to future generations, whether that's skills, heirlooms, songs and stories, or inherited trauma. It's about how ancient songs connect us to the past. It's essentially a family mystery that's ultimately unravelled by following the leads of a murder ballad. The heroine is called Silver, and it's about her father dying and leaving her with a request, which is to find Molly, someone she's never heard of before that moment. It turns out that Molly is an enigmatic folk singer who disappeared in the 60s on the cusp of fame. And it's basically about how her most famous song, called Runaway Lovers, links to the mystery and helps us unravel it. It's set at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, which Silver is actually a conservation assistant or a housemaid at Chatsworth in the present day, which seemed a lovely setting because this is all a book about how the past is always present, and obviously in a beautiful stately home, the past in fact is always present. So that's
and Chatsworth is incredibly beautiful, isn't it? It's in Derbyshire.
It's the most stunning. I mean, it's probably my favourite place to visit ever. And actually my literary agent did describe this book as a love letter to Chatsworth. So if anyone loves Chatsworth, there's lots of details in the book about Chatsworth, and it is almost like a character in the book.
So Keeper of Songs has at its heart a story about folk songs and a folk singer. What is it about the nature of folk music and the stories it can tell that inspired you?
Oh, I think ultimately it's the power of old songs. When you hear someone singing a song that's hundreds of years old, it's somehow sort of bigger than the singer, and it's been shaped by not just one person, but generations of either heartache or passion or pain or love or whatever the theme is of the song. And I think there's a real power in that. I love the fact that all my books have got a connection to history, and these old songs seems to carry history within them. And they obviously were broadside ballads originally, which were the sort of the stories of the newspapers of their day. They've often been handed down through oral history, being handed on from father to son, mother to daughter, and often then reinterpreted for modern audiences, and we give our own sort of version of them. And I think that all of that to me is very beautiful and very, and they themselves, as a storyteller myself, the songs are often beautifully curated narratives with very powerful stories within them, and so the whole drama of them I find very appealing.
And I think that song in particular, which we'll talk about in a moment, it tells a story as so many folk songs do, and it is very much like a story within a story, isn't it? The story of the song, but also the story of the singer that we're on the trail of, and we're trying to find and track down in the wider story. So it's got that sort of Shakespearean play within a play element to it, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So that song we're referring to in the audio drama, sung by Bella Hardy, and it runs through the audio drama version of The Keeper of Songs. Can you tell us a little bit about how you chose that one song in particular and how that inspired you?
Well, it sort of chose me in a way. It's a song. First of all, I should say that the song is by Bella Hardy, and she calls it Henry and Clara. The original song, I mean, again, she's taken the story and interpreted it, which is why I've used her version in my book, and obviously in the audio drama we use her version too. Because my story is all about how the songs have been passed on and changed, so I've used the most modern version, which is Bella's. It's basically set. It's a famous Derbyshire folk song. And I grew up in Sheffield on the edges of Derbyshire. It's about a murder that happened in Winnett's Pass, which is the most extraordinarily spooky, haunting, dramatic. It's like a scene out of Tolkien or a fantasy novel. It's in Castleton in Derbyshire, which is a little village high in the Dark Peak, and it's a limestone gorge that was once under the sea, and it's very narrow, very winding, very twisty. And this couple were murdered there in the 1700s on their way to the wedding chapel to get married in Peak Forest, which was like a Derbyshire's version of Gretna Green. And it's a true story. Clara's saddle is still to be seen in a little museum in Castleton. And there's a link to Chatsworth because the saddle was originally taken back to Chatsworth because the Duke of Devonshire was Lord of the Manor of Castleton as well. I first heard Bella's version of it a few years ago, and I decided to write a book, originally a historical novel set in the 1700s about Henry and Clara. And then it didn't quite work. And then I was sort of thinking, how could I link that to the modern day? And I thought, well, the song is the obvious way to link it to the modern day, to have it's been passed down through the generations to the present day. And so I'll almost follow the route of the song and have the song as linked to the historical story. So the song really was the root of the whole story. Without it, I would have no story.
And it's interesting because it comes from Bella's album called The Dark Peak and the White, which so Bella herself is a Derbyshire singer, and the album, all of the songs on the album are inspired by the Peak District of Derbyshire. So it's a real collection of songs from an area, and I think folk music has this unique way of linking us to regions. It's often very regionalised, isn't it? But it's a fantastic album if you can get a copy of it.
Definitely.
And how have you found the process of, obviously you wrote this as a novel and then you adapted it for our audio drama. How did you find that process of writing for audio?
Well, it's been a lovely thing to do because I originally began my career at the BBC working in radio. So I'm a big fan of audio. The fact that the song is the story is about a song, to actually link my words to the actual song and hear them as people listen to the audio drama, it's sort of interspersed and you listen to my words over the song. It's a very beautiful thing for me to actually hear. To hear the actresses actually speaking my words, I find really quite spine-tingling and a bit strange to start with, but very beautiful. And it's just lovely, as I say, just to hear the story with the song that inspired it.
Fantastic. Yeah, we had a really good Zoom call with Amy Forrest and Keely Lane, who play Silver and Kizzy in the story, and it was I always love that moment when you hear words spoken for the first time by a professional actor. It's a very magical thing, isn't it? So let's hear a little excerpt now from the Keeper of Songs audio drama featuring Amy Forrest and Keely Lane.
Over moors and valleys deep, through the dark peak and the white, there two tragic lovers sleep in gritstone, blood and lime.
It's 2021 now, but I'm going through the cassettes I recorded of conversations with my mum, Silver, nearly 20 years ago. There's no point looking back, my mum used to say. You're not going that way. Which is a bit ironic because she grew up and then went on to work as a conservation assistant or housemaid at Chatsworth, the most beautiful and famous stately home in England, a place that is steeped in centuries of the richest history. Now let's fast forward with Silver to 2002.
I picked up the album sleeve. Molly Marrison, it said. in swirly hippie graphics. My dad had been asking for someone called Molly when he died. His last wish. Tell Silver, find Molly. Who was Molly? I turned the sleeve over. The girl in the photograph was in soft focus and dressed in green velvet and lace with sunset behind her. The sky a blaze of yellow and orange and red. Her skin was dusky with high cheekbones that made her look like a Cherokee. She seemed to be in a trance. Her dark eyes looked straight through me. I found the knob on the record player and I turned it on. Watched the black disc begin to spin. I lifted the needle arm, gliding the stylus on the end of my finger, lowering it gently into the outermost groove. An expectant crackle of static, then an astonishingly beautiful voice filled the cold air. It was sweet and warm like chocolate and gold, though the song was weighted with such awful sorrow and despair.
Now this couple joined as one, laugh so glad the valleys ring. But as they ride for Castleton, cold night comes creeping in. And when it's past so dark and deep, 5 murderous miners lingered there.
So Fiona, you mentioned that your career began in radio. How did you make the transition from that to a career as a very successful writer?
Well, I always wanted to write. In fact, my job, I was at Radio 1 for most of the time, and my job at Radio 1 was writing, because I was actually in the press office. So although I was writing press releases and biographies of John Peel and the likes, it was still writing, and I really enjoyed that element of it. And then I met my husband, who was also working at BBC. I wanted to have children, and we decided to leave London and move to the Cotswolds. I'd always had the idea for Isabella for many, many years. Interestingly, which is also linked to a song, and we'll come back to that later. But Isabella was actually also inspired by music in a way. She definitely was. So I decided to rather drastically, recklessly, foolhardily, however you want to look at it, bravely, just quit my job, move to the Cotswolds and write a book. I've never had anything published ever before. I said, I'm going to write a novel. And that's what I did. It took quite longer than I thought it would, but I sort of kept working at Isabella, and I always think I actually learned how to write with that book. So I've got so many versions of it, but I just kept writing it and rewriting it. And I just thought it was a great story. And eventually I got there, and I thankfully got it published.
You know, that coming back to music again, I mean, you say there's a musical inspiration for Isabella, which I'm sure we'll find out about in a moment. But I mean, clearly music's been important throughout your career, working for a music radio station and now writing novels and dramas that have music as influences within them. Are you one of the people that can listen to music as you write? Do you find that music kind of inspires your creativity in that way?
I always listen to music when I write, and that's how I sort of switch off. I switch off the real world. I have a little shepherd's hut in my garden that I write in, and when I go in there, the first thing I do is put some music on, and that just switches off the real world and takes me into another world. And if I get stuck, which I frequently do, then I'll go for a walk, or I'll go on my cross train and do some exercise and put some music on. And 9 times out of 10, listening to music will do something to my brain and creative processes, and it will unravel whatever problem I'm having. So I don't think I could write without music.
I think writers fall into one or two camps, don't they? That some say it's got to be silent. Some say it can only be instrumental or classical music. Others just embrace any music and find that music sets the tone. And do you find that you listen to different music when you're writing different things?
Definitely. And if I want to, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be it's from the same era or about the same time. I wasn't only listening to folk music when I was writing this book, but it's almost like whatever emotion a certain song conjures, and if I'm trying to describe that emotion in a particular scene, then I'll use that song to actually help me get into that frame of mind, and I find it works really, really well. So Isabella is my first novel, and it's about it's the love story behind the Mutiny on the Bounty, which is obviously a story that many people are familiar with through the Hollywood films. But this one looks at Isabella, who was Fletcher Christian, leader of the mutineers' cousin, and she lived on Belle Isle, which is a little island in the middle of Lake Windermere, which is actually named after her. And there are various rumours that Fletcher Christian, after the mutiny, secretly returned to England and hid out on Belle Isle with Isabella. Interestingly, there's also Fletcher Christian's Tahitian wife. After the mutiny, he took a Tahitian wife with him to Pitcairn Island, who was called Miamiti, but he named her Isabella as well. So I sort of took those two elements and thought, well, was he in love with his cousin, as the rumours suggest? And if he came back, why did he come back, and what happened? And that's where I took the inspiration for that story from.
The news of the Pandora's return to England and the capture of the mutineers soon spread all over Cumberland. When it became known that Captain Edwards had failed in his attempt to find Fletcher, and nothing more was heard of his whereabouts, it was generally assumed that he was lost forever, and the bounty with him, that he had perished at sea somewhere far away. That is, I suppose, what people wanted to think. That was justice. He was a villain who had betrayed his king and his country. Death was the best, the only punishment. I tried to come to terms with the possibility of his death, but something stopped me accepting it. I could not look at the sky and the water and the mountains and imagine that in this world he no longer existed. I could not feel the beat of my heart and believe that his no longer beat. It seemed inconceivable that I would never see him again. I went for long solitary walks and rides over the bleak purple fells out past Ambleside. The footpaths which afforded the most spectacular scenery were oddly deserted now the lake tourists had left. I passed only the shepherds bringing the sheep down from the upper pastures in time for winter. I walked quickly until my heart was pounding and the muscles in my chest and at the back of my legs were tight with fatigue. I tried to lose myself in physical activity. I tried not to think of Fletcher. But I heard his laughter, playful, mischievous, coming from somewhere very close, as if he was hiding behind a rock or a tree and was waiting to leap out and surprise me. I heard his rage. If I die, I will come back to haunt you.
You mentioned that a lot of your novels, probably all of your novels, are really, you could call them historical novels. How much both historical and social research do you tend to do when you're getting ready to write a new book?
I probably do way too much, actually, to be honest, because I love that part of it. I mean, I always think researching a book lets you explore things you would never normally explore, and it takes you down all sorts of really weird and wonderful roads. I make life very difficult for myself because, as I've explained with the books that we've talked about, they're all different periods in history, and they're all different locations in the world, they're different characters, and so rather than lots of novelists, Philippa Gregory, for instance, will settle on, I'm going to write about the Tudors, and then she'll research the Tudors, and then she's in that mindset, whereas I've just dipped about all over the place. So I've made my life very difficult, but I think I just pick a story that I want to write, and I spend a lot of time researching it. Things like the Cavalier Queen, which was set in the Civil War, was hugely challenging because the Civil War is so complicated. So to actually try and make it less complicated, to understand it myself first of all, and then try and make it less complicated so that I could put it into a story, and then not make the story really boring, because actually there's a whole element of Civil Wars where it's the Bishops' Wars, and then they go to Scotland and they declare peace, and I've had to condense that down into sort of a very short space of time, otherwise people would just get really bored. So I do a lot of historical research, and as far as the societal research goes, I mean, I try and talk to people who can help me to get into the mind of whatever characters I'm writing about. So for The Keeper of Songs, I was very fortunate and honoured and thrilled to be helped with that story by 3 people. Without it, who couldn't have been written. One of who is Christine Robinson, who was the former head housekeeper at Chatsworth, who spent a lot of time with me talking about what life was like as a housemaid, and behind the scenes. She gave me a lovely tour behind the scenes when they were getting ready for Christmas, which was magical. And she's written 2 brilliant books herself, The Housekeeper's Tales, about life in Chatsworth. I also spoke to Silver, who's a heroine, is also a blacksmith, and I spoke to a wonderful lady called Beck Simon, who's a very inspiring, incredibly artistic blacksmith who let me go and have a go at her on her anvil, which was fantastic. And then Sam Lee, who, last but not least at all, Sam, it was basically discovering one of his songs, Lovely Molly, which is given the name to Molly, who is our character in the story. And Sam, I've spent so many fascinating evenings talking to him and listening to his music and going to his concerts. The first time I met him, I went to St Ives in December, and he was doing a beautiful concert in the art shack, sort of by the sea, unaccompanied songs with just the sound of the waves, and it was one of the most magical experiences I've ever had. I've also done singing with nightingales with him in the woods. Just his stories of song collecting and his recollections of the power of old songs has totally infused the whole of my book. I mean, all credit to him, really, because actually if he hadn't been his albums were, I did listen to those over and over again as a soundtrack to the book when I was writing it.
Yeah, Sam Lee's a particular favourite of mine as well. So we'll put a link to, so you can find out more about Sam Lee in our show notes for this one. He's just brought out a book all about the Nightingale, in fact,
which is an absolutely wonderful book. I've read it, and it's just beautiful and beautiful illustrated, beautiful lyrical language, and it's well worth a read.
Absolutely, and some really fascinating stories about nightingales and their, the stories they inspire all over the world. Actually, we don't mention him in the audio drama, but the male character, the hero of the book, is actually called Robbie Nightingale, which I've borrowed from Sam's. See what you did there.
Yeah, Nightingale. It'd be interesting actually, because Nightingale is itself a Derbyshire name, because Florence Nightingale grew up in Derbyshire, so it was a no-brainer, really. That had to be his name. Okay, so Lady of the Butterflies is about a real person again, and that is Lady Eleanor Glanville, who has given her name to the beautiful little Glanville fritillary butterfly. She's in fact the Glanville fritillary is the only butterfly to have its name from a person. And Eleanor, I found in a footnote in a history book, because she lived in the 1700s, and she had her will overturned by her family on the grounds that nobody in their right mind would go in pursuit of butterflies. But she was recognised by eminent scientists of her day as a very skilled lepidopterist, but she was working in a time when butterflies were seen as spirits of the dead, and anyone who was interested in them was a necromancer. Metamorphosis was seen as a proof that alchemy could be a real thing, and women were believed to cast malign influences over experiments. They were not invited to the Royal Society and all those kind of places. So she was working in a very strange time, very brave, very pioneering, and I just, that footnote basically completely captured me, and I decided to tell her story.
I saw the warning flash in Richard's blue eyes, like lightning in a summer sky, swift and searing. A charge of angry power that suddenly made me almost afraid of him. "Forgive me, I should not have said that." "By all means." His tone was very cold. "It makes no difference whether you say it or not, if it is what you think." "I don't think. I wasn't thinking. I'm just angry. Why do the Sherbans not want Annie to work with me, for God's sake?" "They are not the only ones who think the girl should not be doing what you've had her doing," he said flatly. Collecting caterpillars and assisting with their care? What the devil is so wrong with that? Have you even paused to wonder why Mrs. Keene has lost her help in the kitchen, and since yesterday there is no longer anyone to work in the brewhouse? Admittedly, I had been rather preoccupied of late, but the issue with the kitchen maid I did know about. Alice Walker was needed at the mill, wasn't she? Only because her brothers didn't want her near this house. They have heard tales, Richard said. They have all heard tales. What kind of tales? That you seek out caterpillars and keep their coffins, waiting for the worms to grow wings. They say only a witch would be concerned with such things. They say it is evil. I felt my spine tingle at the use of those words. I had hoped it was godly. Shape-shifting, Nell. Use the brain God gave you. They see it as unholy, akin to attempting to breed a werewolf. That was not quite so preposterous as it might sound, since metamorphosis had been put forward as proof that werewolves could exist, just as it had been used as to argue that alchemy was a possibility.
So, I mean, you've described, how you've researched a lot of the books, and it strikes me from what you've told me already about Keeper of Songs and the influences of Chatsworth and Winnet's Pass in that story that place is very important in your storytelling as well. I suppose we're lucky in England because within a very short drive you can actually get to a lot of these places. Do you travel much when you're doing your research?
Yes, I do. I mean, Isabella is set in the Lake District, and I spent a lot of time in the Lake District. And again, I think the Lake District is very much a character in that novel, and definitely set the whole tone for the story. The two genealogical mysteries are set in the Cotswolds, which is where I live, and so I know really well. Lady of the Butterflies is set in the Somerset Levels, which is definitely a really inspiring place to be. And I was lucky, her house, Tickenham Court, is still there. It's privately owned, but the owner of it let me spend quite a lot of time there, and I saw her the rooms that she lived in, and that really, I found that really inspiring. And then Chatsworth, I spent a lot of time in Chatsworth, and I know it really well over my childhood. Definitely that the beauty and drama of Chatsworth has inspired the book very much so. And
so with all this research and this travel and visiting, do you try and be as historically accurate as you can be in your writing, or is telling a good story paramount?
I do try and be as historically accurate as I can. So, for instance, with Cavalier Queen, that was the hardest one to write because there's so much documented evidence about Henrietta Maria and Charles, about where they were on certain dates, what they were doing on certain dates, and I got myself in a bit of a tangle with that, really. But my sort of rule, and I do break it occasionally, but very occasionally and with great consideration, is I'll only fill in the gaps where there are gaps. So if things are known about someone, I won't meddle. But if there's question marks over them, or if there are gaps in the historical records, then I feel permitted to interpret what might have happened. I do, but I do. I mean, because I love history, so therefore I feel it's a responsibility to be as truthful to it as I can be.
I guess even when you're speculating slightly, that you're doing so in a very kind of educated way because you've been so accurate for the rest of the story. The chances are you're not going to be a million miles wide of the mark, I guess.
No.
Yeah.
Hope not. So Cavalier Queen, the Cavalier Queen of the title is Queen Henrietta Maria, who was the Queen of King Charles I, who was the king who famously had his head chopped off in the Civil War. And she's a much maligned queen. She's not a very popular queen, but she's French, and she came over at the age of 14 to marry King Charles, having never met him, and it's sort of a kind of a slightly Princess Diana story. She, in the middle of the Civil War, she rolled up her sleeves, led an army, was sent into exile, basically raised arms for the king. And by her side was this chap called Henry Jermyn, who Jermyn Street in the West End is named after, who was her right-hand man, and various rumours that they had a love affair have always continued since the Civil War. And so I took that as, again, a rumour that I've worked with and decided to explore what might have happened if that were true.
By mid-June, the Queen's Own Army reached Newark on the River Trent, where the flag was raised, and though Henrietta was keen to press on, she saw the wisdom in resting, replenishing supplies, and recruiting more soldiers. Together, she and Harry gave directions for ordering the camp, setting men to work digging ramparts and trenches. Her tent had barely been erected when she was visited there by 3 noble ladies of the town who requested an audience. They stepped gingerly across the grass in their silk slippers, lifting up their skirts as if walking through the mire of a pigsty, their eyes scanning the Queen's appearance and living quarters with a scandalised disdain. The corner of the tent was stacked high with swords and muskets, while Henrietta wore a pistol but no jewels, and her windswept ringlets were pinned carelessly atop her head. The hem of her cloak and her boots were muddied and dusty. Since she had been washing in streams and pools, she had a streak of mud on her cheek, too. "For your safety's sake," the oldest one said, "we petition your grace not to march from Newark until Nottingham is properly taken." "I thank you for your concern," Henrietta replied, summoning her small reserves of patience. "But I am commanded by the king to make haste to him. You may learn by my example to obey your husbands at all times." She heard a low chuckle and, glancing up, saw Harry leaning in the doorway of the tent, listening to the exchange. "What did you find so amusing earlier?" she challenged, after the ladies had gone and she was sitting with him in the warm evening sun, eating chicken off the bone with her fingers. "You may learn by my example to obey your husbands," he quoted. "With respect, you are not the most submissive of wives yourself, are you?" She tossed her chicken bone to one of the dogs and licked her fingers. "Parliament has decided that I am guilty of treason, just like you. We are not merely vagabonds now, but outlaws both."
So I want to talk a little bit about your writing practice and processes, and we talked about you being inspired by music and listening to music as you write. Obviously, as a creative person, like many of the listeners of this podcast, you'll have been working and trying to be creative throughout the pandemic, which has been, one of the great upheavals of all of our lives, really.
Yeah.
How would you say it's affected your work and creativity, and do you feel it's influenced anything you've written or the ways in which you've thought about writing?
That's a really good question. I found it quite hard because I think one of my editors, Rosie, always said to me that when I was going through a very traumatic divorce, and she said, "You're going to really struggle to write, because in order to write, for most people, and I'm certainly one of these people, the fictional world that you're inhabiting has to be more real to you than the real world. So you have to let go of the real world and go into it, and that whole, the characters and the setting, you have to be living most of the time in that world. And normally, I'm really happy in that state. I'd rather live more than half the time in a world of my own imagining. But with the pandemic, and when I was going through divorce, and I liken that to the pandemic, it's what's going on in the real world is so dramatic and scary and unpleasant that somehow, no matter how much, that's the absolute time when you want to lose yourself in a different story, but it's the absolute time that I struggle to, because it was too much in my face. So when I was sitting there, even in my little writing shop, which normally I can close the door and shut the real world out, it was invading somehow in there in my head, and I have found it quite difficult to shut it out, and even to read and to watch TV and forget what's going on. I've found quite hard.
Yeah, I think most of the people I've spoken to have said it's kind of always there, isn't it? It's hanging over you.
I read an article about it actually, I thought, which was really helpful, and it was about how evolutionarily wise we are programmed to obviously be aware of danger, and if we go into a flight or fight mode, which is our alert to danger, other processes in our body get shut down. And actually the creative dreaming process that you need to be a writer or be a creative, it actually was an article in the New York Times. It said actually it's shut down so that you can actually be in this fight or flight. And I think we've all been in a kind of fight or flight mode for the past year. And so I think inevitably we've not been able to be quite so, so creative and so productive in that regard as just sort of, even though the threat of danger wasn't sort of completely in our faces the whole time, it's there. It's been in the background the whole time, hasn't it? And I think therefore it's been quite hard to let it go.
I think, as you talked about, having music on in the background in some ways colours the way you write or what you write. It feels to me that it would be difficult to be a creative person not acknowledging what was going on. We talked to a lot of writers about things like climate change, and that for a lot of writers, they couldn't not talk about it. It's always there. And I think the pandemic has been like that for a lot of writers as well. You must have written quite a bit of The Keeper of Songs during the pandemic, though.
Yeah, I mean, I have, but I was, I think, fortunate with that because I was refining it. So it was all. I mean, I'm so slow, and I've also combined it with other jobs, and I'm a single mother of 4 children, so I don't have a huge amount of time. So things take me a long time to write. But I think I was lucky that I'd done most of the bulk of it. So I was editing. So actually the world was there and I wasn't creating it from scratch. So I could actually escape into it quite nicely without having to do it. So I was refining it, and I was sort of colouring it in and moving bits around and making the sentences, more flow better. And so I think had I been at the beginning of a book where I'm trying to come up with the original plot and lose myself in it completely, I think I'd have really struggled. I was quite lucky in where I was at with the rewriting with it.
Yeah.
So Bloodline is the second actually in a series of books, or I say a series of 2. There were going to be more. It's a genealogical mystery featuring Natasha Blake, who is a genealogist. And I took as the idea the fact that family historians are similar to detectives. In fact, often they're referred to as ancestor detectives because they're solving mysteries and piecing together clues, much like a criminal detective. There are 2 books in the series, Hail as the Dead, which is the first one, and Bloodline. And they're basically contemporary novels set in the Cotswolds, but with a historical subplot that Natasha is researching as part of her genealogical work. The first one, Hail as the Dead, is the historical subplot is a pre-Raphaelite artist. With Bloodline, it's the kind of dark side of genealogy, and it's the Nazis' eugenics program, in particular a plot which was the sort of flip side of the genocide, in that they were trying to repopulate the world with Aryan race children bred from Lebensborn homes, which were young girls basically matched up with SS officers and encouraged to have children with them. And there was various theories that there might have been plans to have one in the UK. And actually, weirdly, after the book came out, there was a feature in the Daily Mail about exactly that story. But again, I've taken that idea and decided to work with what might have happened if there was one, or if there were plans to have one that went a bit further than we think they did.
She was at the crossroads, the point where the road from Chipping Campden to Snowshill intersected the Foss Way. She drove along the Moreton to Evesham Road at least 3 times a week, waited at this particular crossroads every time she went to Camden for a postage stamp or a loaf of bread. She couldn't believe it had been there all the time, just a few metres away. Beyond the screen of trees was a different world, a different age. When she turned onto a dirt track, there, no more than a couple of metres away from the road, shielded from it by a row of conifers and scrub, was the first unmistakable remains of the Spring Hill prisoner of war camp. A long, low, weathered red brick building, part rendered, the single skin walls strengthened with narrow buttresses every couple of feet, tall, narrow chimneys at either end. The bricks were stained with gangrenous lime-green moss, gaping holes in the tarred felt roofs, the paned glass windows broken, and one wall crumbled away. Alongside it was another building in better condition, part of the wall now a corrugated iron door to give access to the rusted and broken-down farm machinery stored within it. A BMW was parked up ahead, a man in a smart grey suit sitting behind the wheel. She turned off the engine, got out of the car, and he did the same. He gave an insincere smile of acknowledgement, and she was aware of how very still and quiet it was. He had told her on the phone that he'd worked in the Foreign Office for 20 years, and it was immediately obvious that he was fairly high-ranking. He wore his success on the sleeve of his grey Savile Row suit, as others might wear their heart.
What are the plans for the publication of The Keeper of Songs, Fiona?
Well, interestingly, I mean, we've been talking about music a lot, and how music has inspired me. And I have definitely taken this for the actual publication of this book, because when I was a youngster, I would, my heroine was Kate Bush, and I wanted to be Kate Bush, basically. I'd love to have been a singer or a rock star or whatever, but wasn't to be, because I can't sing very well at all, and I've got slightly tone deaf. But by the by, so I've always been inspired by musicians as well. And actually, Isabella, we were talking about Isabella to start with, and I had a crush when I was a teenager on David Essex, who was in a musical called Mutiny, which is how I actually found that story. But this, I've been published by two of the big publishing houses, so Orion and Random House, for 5 of my books. This one, however, which has been quite a checkered ride, I have to say, some of it good, some of it bad. And this book was halfway through being sort of sold, and I don't know how much part the pandemic played in it, but basically my agent, having been very confident that I was going to get a publishing deal, wasn't able to find me one. Literally, she was trying to sell it in as the pandemic was hitting New York, and all the publishing houses closed, which was really depressing and dismaying, really. Because I just, she was confident we'd sell it, I was confident we'd sell it, we didn't. I then sort of started looking at the whole indie trend, as it's been called, which is independent publishing, and I thought, actually, when I was at Radio 1, indie was associated with super cool bands like The Cure and the Stone Roses and the Arctic Monkeys. And I read a book, which I don't know if you know, if you're familiar with, called How Soon Is Now, the Madmen and Mavericks Who Made Independent Music. And that talks about the rebellion and anti-corporate idealism of indie culture. And I thought, do you know what? I quite like that idea. So I've decided that I'm publishing this book rather than waiting and trying to sell it and what have you. I'm going to publish it myself. So I've created a publishing imprint called Snow Globe Books. And I am publishing it through Snow Globe Books in July. So it'll be available in all the usual places. I'm publishing it with Amazon and with Ingram Spark, which means it'll be in bookshops, it'll be on Amazon, it'll be everywhere you would normally buy a book, it'll be paperback and ebook, possibly an audiobook. I'm thinking about doing that. I'm not sure yet. It depends how the audio drama goes down. Mm-hmm. So that's my plans for it, basically.
Fantastic, and we wish you all the best. And I think Alternative Stories can certainly vouch to share that indie kind of ethos, because we're fiercely independent as well. So
yes, absolutely. I think it's the way to go. I think increasingly, I've since decided to go down that route, met lots of other authors who have made very successful careers out of being independently published, and have actually been approached by publishing houses and said, well, what can you offer me that I can't do myself? And they can't. So I'm certainly learning an awful lot about publishing, which I'm finding really fascinating. And yeah, it feels a very healthy, fast, interesting, and journey to go on, and we'll see where it leads.
So finally, Fiona, how can our listeners find out more about your work and buy or pre-order, in the case of The Keeper of Songs, your books?
Okay, so the best thing to do is to anyone who is interested in buying The Keeper of Songs is to sign up to my newsletter on my website, because it's not available yet on Amazon for pre-order. But if you sign up to my newsletter, you'll be getting all sorts of offers and interesting extra information, and that's the best way. And then I'll be letting you know when you can actually order it online and through bookshops.
Fantastic, and we'll print links to your website and your social media so that people can follow you and find out all about your other books and your career, and of course The Keeper of Songs. And we'll also let you know when the audio drama version of Keeper of Songs will be coming out, and we'll probably try and time that alongside the publication of the novel, so that they can kind of complement each other, I think. So, Fiona Mountain, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Fiona Mountain for joining us on the podcast today. Excerpts from Fiona's novels were read by Sally Walker-Taylor and introduced by Fiona herself. The excerpts from the audio drama version of The Keeper of Songs were mixed by Nicholas John and featured the voices of actors Amy Forrest and Keely Lane. You also heard the track Henry and Clara by Bella Hardy, which features in the drama. The track is taken from Bella's album The Dark Peak and the White, and we'll provide links so you can purchase a copy as part of our show notes. The notes will also include full credits for the audio drama and links to Fiona's website and social media to help you buy copies of her books. You'll be able to hear the full drama on the podcast in late June or early July. Watch our social media for more details. Coming soon on Alternative Stories, you'll be able to hear our audio drama based on Cornish folklore, The Silver Ball by Anna Chalton. We'll also have poetry from Gregory Ledbetter and his Nine Arches Press collection, Maskwork. If you're interested in writing audio drama or meeting some of the voices behind Alternative Stories, you might like to join our forthcoming Introduction to Writing for Audio Drama workshop. This will be an online event on the 17th of May, starting at 6:30 p.m. UK time. You can buy tickets via Eventbrite, and we'll post a link in the show notes for this podcast. Thank you for listening to this edition of Alternative Stories and Fake Realities. Please subscribe in your favourite podcast app to have all future episodes delivered directly to your podcast feed and to have access to our full archive of audio drama, poetry and fiction podcasts. This has been an Alternative Stories 2021 production for the Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast.
We always appreciate ratings and reviews, preferably in Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. These help to raise the profile of our podcast, allowing more people to listen and more content to be produced.
The Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast. Audio drama, poetry, fiction.